I'll just wait for Shireen to give confirmation. Okay, I think we are recording. Okay, I'll be starting now. Hello, I was a chair for the round. With me in the panel was Hinano. We had one for deliberation. So I'll start first with the verdict and then justify our collective decision as a panel. So the first goes to opening opposition, the second goes to closing opposition, the third goes to opening government, and the fourth goes to closing gov. So the first and second were unanimously decided. The third and fourth were decided through consensus. Again, in chronological order, I'll be sending it in the chat. It's OO, CO, OG, and then CG. I'll start the OA by first discussing opening half. So in OG and OO, I think there were a couple of salient clashes that we identified. So the first is on the issue of competition versus monopoly. Opening Gov here says that when you have exclusive contracts between youth academies and professional clubs, you create a direct pipeline that allows professional clubs to concentrate the power and the extraction of talent away that comes at the detriment of other teams as well in the sport. The way in which opening up explains that competition and monopoly is an important issue is to suggest that it probably exists either way in status quo because the status quo is one where sports in general are dominated by a select few teams only. But secondly, if it's about the competition and monopoly, the monopoly is not as bad as opening golf paints it to be. Insofar as if OG is true that youth academies are partners with multiple different professional clubs at the same time, and these professional clubs can offer their own competitive rates, then there is some sort of competition existing still, even if the pool of competitors is still small. I think it is opening golf's burden to explain why the reduction in competition is the tipping point for making them for banning these exclusive youth contracts at all. So that explains the competition versus monopoly issue. The second is about youth development, and it is also where I integrate discussions about the leverage of professional clubs on youth athletes. So the first discussion here is about exploitation. So opening gov here says that the exclusive contracts are exploitative because this often leaves youth athletes with no alternatives but to go to professional clubs because those are the clubs that like train them for a long period of time, and there's also the sunk cost. So eventually they go to these very same clubs. The way in which opening up contends with the exploitation thing is to say that they can still have some sort of their counter policy can ensure some reasonable contracts existing, and I buy this particular counter policy from opening up because um, opening up does explain why there are existing legal mechanisms that monitor, and so we can just pattern the counter policy on those existing legal frameworks. Opening gov under like the response to fiat says that it's an abuse of fiat from opening up, but the panel feels like it's not an abuse of fiat because if opening gov's concern is that it takes a lot of resources, the government is going to be bureaucratic and will therefore take a long time to process all of these monitoring. I think that same criticism also applies to their side when you have to ban these kinds of things and you therefore have to subject the policy to the same kind of bureaucracy that the counter policy of opposition will be subject to. So we think that that response from opening gov does not bear much weight in this particular exchange. And that explains why you can moderate the exploitation that's going to happen. But the second way in which opening up contends with the exploitation issue is to suggest that absent these exclusive youth contracts, what you'd have instead in opening golf are youth wings directly under the supervision of these professional clubs, which are far more exploitative because now they have a direct pipeline under these youth athletes as compared to a youth academy that is relatively more independent because it is funded by multiple different professional clubs at the same time. So if in terms of the extent of exploitation, I think opening up explains why the extent of exploitation is far lesser when you have youth academies existing. Um, yeah, the third issue under opening gov and opening opposition is about the stagnation of the sport. So opening gov here says that games become more predictable because now it's just the same players playing over and over again. Like the skill sets are not too enjoyable for fans anyway. The way in which opening up contends with this is to say that if it's true that in OO, you also develop the skills of mid-level or second-level players, then you also inject more variability and make games less predictable. But secondly, opening golf also has a counter push to the stagnation of the sport. In fact, opening up says that when you remove youth academies and make investing into youth academies more risky, the tendency for professional clubs is to continue buying and selling and just investing in the same players over and over again. And that's where you make games more predictable and less variable and less competitive. So in terms of the stagnation of the sport, I think opening up also explains why games the quality of games are not compromised by youth academies having exclusive contracts, but also absent these kinds of contracts, you make professional clubs less willing to invest in other players and just continue investing in the same players over and over again. And that deals with opening gov and opening up. The next thing that I'll introduce in this OA is closing government. So closing government has a couple of interesting contributions here. The first thing that they did is to diagnose where exactly these youth academies are located. And if both the panel members feel like they do this pretty well, they explain that oftentimes these youth academies are located in foreign nations where the costs of training these individuals are cheaper. There's far less regulation, therefore it's easier to conduct operations there. The first comparison that we will make is against opening opposition. The first reason why this extension from closing gov is unable to beat opening opposition is primarily because while they do diagnose the problem and explain that it results in the deprioritization of national athletes, like athletes within your borders, the problem is that closing gov doesn't explain the solvency to the problem that they diagnose. If it's true that you have a deprioritization, there is unequal rigor placed in explaining how this problem gets resolved on their side. The extent of analysis that they provide is that you will focus instead on national athletes, but we think that opening opposition already provides preemptive reasons as to why, without exclusive youth contracts, professional clubs won't invest into the development of athletes in general because of the risky nature of training and investing in these individuals for a longer period of time. And without the explanation about how you change the incentives of professional clubs in closing government, we don't think that the explanation about the new characterization of youth academies makes shifts the comparative any different from what opening gov provides. The next comparison that I'll do with regards to closing gov is against opening gov themselves. It's against opening gov. So opening gov and closing gov diagnose different problems for to justify the ban. So opening gov says that it's because of the decreased amount of agency and the decreased amount of competition. Closing gov says that the problem lies in the deprioritization of national athletes. While the panel feels like both of these problem identifications are different from each other, the endpoint in which they tie back this problem identification is still the same, such that the poor in up bench will be left off because they don't have enough access to a lot of training resources. They get deprioritized in favor of other individuals. So in opening golf, the explanation might be that the poor get deprioritized in favor of better athletes. Closing golf says that the poor get deprioritized in favor of people from other nations. While the actor is different, we felt like Closing Gov wasn't able to explain meaningfully why that difference in actor shifts the comparative in the round. Closing Gov says that the poor, like you have an obligation to the poor because they're more proximate to you. But we think that like to your own athletes. But even if there is an obligation, we fail to see how this obligation is necessarily met in closing government, which is tied to my discussion earlier about how they fail to solve the problem that they themselves diagnose. So while there is a different reason to be that we should ban, I don't think closing gov explains why they solve it, or B, why the demographic, where the people affected by current status quo are more harmful, apart from the fact that they're from developing nations and they're more proximate to them. Yeah, so that explains why opening golf still wins over closing golf. The next thing that I'll introduce in the OA is closing opposition. So closing opposition says a couple of things. They say that the poor get access to a lot of training programs when you have youth academies existing, because a counterfactual would be that they'd be poached by predatory, suspicious teams that want to take advantage of their vulnerability at the point where they're still kids. The second thing they get from closing opposition is an explanation about why the poor oftentimes only have like sports as a last resort and there are only few alternatives, but also the poor also want to become athletes because they tend to model like they look up to their role models, etc. But the next thing that I hear from closing opposition is an explanation from opposition whip that there is a potential for good teams who previously worked for other teams in other nations to eventually give back, and that's how you make the development of sports more holistic and institutional. The first way that I'll do is against closing opposition. The first reason why closing opposition wins over opening gov is because they explain why the agency of the poor will probably be vitiated either way because it's probably their only alternative. Therefore, they're left with no choice but to go to sports. But secondly, they explain that oftentimes the poor are ensconced in cults of personality that drive them to pursue sports either way. This explanation makes the panel see that even if you ban youth exclusive contracts inside opening government, wait, sorry, there's a loud noise outside. Sorry. Okay, so sorry for that. A car drove by and they're playing loud music. Um, so I'll continue where I left off. I was discussing the agency thing against opening up and closing up. So we felt like closing up just explains why the agency of individuals will be vitiated either way for exogenous reasons outside of the existence of youth exclusive contracts, which diminishes the validity of the problem posed by opening off. The second reason why closing up wins over opening off is because their explanation about the counterfactual of opening off. It's not one where the poor have access in general because they might have access to training, but the quality of that training and the people who reach out to them are going to be different. It's probably going to be lower ranking teams who are predatory and who will take advantage of the vulnerability of youth athletes at this point in time. And that's the reason why the poor get better off opportunities in opening golf. The next comparison that I'll do is between closing opposition against closing government. So the same reason why opening up wins over closing government is also the same reason why CO wins over CG. While closing golf does diagnose a problem of deprioritization of national athletes, closing opposition doesn't explain why. Closing government doesn't explain how they eventually solve it. In comparison to closing opposition, who might not specify the actors to national athletes or non-national athletes. But what we do get from closing opposition is that the poor will be benefited either way, and there's some degree of solvency left in closing opposition to explain that the youth exclusive contracts are not as bad as closing golf paints them to be. Otherwise, these poor people will be left to shady teams who will poach them and take advantage of their vulnerability. The last comparison that we'll do is compare opening up and closing opposition. The main reason why closing opposition loses to opening opposition is firstly in terms of the counterfactual. Opening up's counterfactual is that the poor will be blocked out of opportunities because professional clubs now tend to buy and sell players that are already good. Closing up's explanation of the counterfactual is that they will be poached instead by predatory teams. We think that there's not clear explanation from closing opposition to explain why this comparative specifically on their side shifts the degree of harm that happens that in opening up because what opening up explains that these people are actively blocked out already and they're unable to lift themselves out of poverty, which is also the same premise that comes from closing opposition. The second reason why closing option loses to opening is because opening is already able to explain the fundamental reason why exclusive contracts have to exist for professional clubs to continue investing in younger athletes in general, and that is because of the risk of training and investing in these individuals for a long period of time. At best, what I get from closing opposition is an explanation of the impacts of them staying within exclusive contracts, but the prerequisite analysis for why they have the incentive to remain contributing to youth athletes' development or they come from opening up. And that is the reason why opening up still has to win over closing up. If you have any questions about that ends OA, if you have any questions about the call, and if you feel like some things were misrepresented, like unrepresented entirely, you can just reach out to me and my panelist. Hinano also has a lot of good insights. Yeah.
Hi, CG has some questions, if you can ask
Okay.
now, if that's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the justification that came to, I don't think just differentiating CG and OG, but also CG and all the other teams is that we didn't
Mhm.
prove why the other stakeholder is more important. The first thing, though, I think the stakeholder that's being identified is not correct. I don't know if we weren't clear enough. It's not national players, it's players from your own academy that are signed under your own team's football association in your home country. But
Mhm.
secondly, what about the mechanism that we give in terms of why these players are a lot more proximate to the club because of culture, because they are more like have been in the club system for a longer time, the duty that the club owes to them because these are families that have sacrificed everything in hopes to play for the first team, given that this is like a direct funnel because you're directly signing up for the club's youth academy. Thirdly, the erosion of like a sustainable pipeline of your youth team because now people don't have the incentive to join the youth team if like all the players are just going to be signed. from a foreign league. And I think this third mechanism here expands the impact beyond just the poor person, but it's to the club as well. And in terms of your sustainability of getting a consistent pipeline. And also I think like this is mitigated by like the alternatives that we give in terms of like foreign players can join their own national leagues if they are so talented and stuff. And I don't think all of this was like covered in the OA. So I'm just wondering how this was weighed.
Okay, so I'll first tackle the first question about the wrong actor identification. So in the OA, we describe them as national youth athletes, whereas your concern is that you explain as you the way that you argue them is that they are under national youth academies. So like even if we change the denomination of the actor name in the oral adjudication, the justification will still be the same because the case as we understood it from closing government is that when you prioritize the um, athletes from foreign youth academies, it comes at the detriment of national athletes who are in national youth academies because they get far less resources and are therefore deprioritized in the selection process because they want to maintain good PR, etc., etc. So I think that the justification would still apply even if you change the name of the actor in the OA. The second is about the idea of cultural obligation and how you're more proximate. Again, the way in which the panel weighed this is that the obligation is not proven to be satisfied when you ban the existence of exclusive youth contracts with youth academies, because opening opposition already explains preemptively why the reason why professional clubs invest in youth athletes is because of the security that they'll be free from the risk of these players going out to other teams or going to other clubs. And so there's like training is very risky and you need the exclusive contract to balance that risk. With regards to closing option, what closing option says is that in the interim period where the athlete is starting out, they're likely to be poached instead by lower level teams and not get the training that they deserve. So while you do point out that there is some degree of obligation, the way for us to fully buy that claim as a panel is if you pair that with an analysis that explains why you fulfill that obligation at the end. Otherwise, it becomes an incentive, but not a reason for us to believe that you get to satisfy that incentive at the end. I'm sorry, I wasn't able to catch a third question.
Before I go into the third one, just on the first one, so OO
Mhm.
says that the risk has to be balanced to make sure kids aren't out on the streets. I'm just wondering, the panel bought that a football club owes an obligation to prevent kids in foreign countries being out in the streets more than that they own an obligation to make sure that their own youth players are making it to the first team.
Yeah, so like our justification would still be the same. Like, there is a matter of obligation. But it's not a matter of the obligation existing, but a matter of how you fulfill that obligation. Um, yeah, so my answer would still be the same.
Okay, I just don't see how that obligation exists in the first place. But going back to the third thing, it expands beyond the
Wait, sorry.
obligation to the.
Can I just clarify for a bit? So I
Yeah,
don't think
go ahead.
opening up says that you have inherently an obligation. It is CG who explains that this particular actor has an obligation to particular other entity. And so like CG inadvertently place a self-imposed burden on themselves to explain why that obligation has to be satisfied.
I mean, it's a self-imposed burden that's more intuitive than what the rest of the round is talking about. So I think that's a fair self-imposed burden when the rest of the round is talking about things that are very speculative and uncertain. But beyond that, it's on the third point about
Mhm.
sustainability, where we talk about what happens when you signal to your youth, national youth academy players. I mean, since that's the way that the panel saw it, that they are not going to be guaranteed a first team spot. What is the incentive then for me to participate in these national youth teams versus just not participating at all because you're going to prioritize these foreign players anyway? Doesn't that erode the operations of the club, the sustainability of the club to invest in more youth players in the long term and stuff like that? This was like explicitly mentioned to through both our speeches.
Okay, so I think this issue was is rooted in the idea that there is a national youth academy and a foreign youth academy, and it's about the incentive of individuals in the national youth academy to continue playing. The reason why the panel felt like this was relatively deprioritized in the round was because there's no clear explanation, again, from closing government to explain why you have to prioritize national youth academies firstly. The explanation is about cultural obligations and proximity. But again, this would circle back to my initial explanation in question number 2 about how you don't fulfill that obligation um, at the end of the case.
Okay, it's fine. We'll just file our grievances through feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. That's extremely valid as well.
Thank you.
Hi, Shireen. I'm gonna leave the room now.